Let's go ahead and get started. So what we're going to talk about, we're going to review the considerations of adopting assessment tools for your own use, your own learners, at your own institution, wherever you might be. And we're going to also talk about the 5 steps we use to adapt the assessment tools for your use. There's 5 steps, and we're going to start first with this creation of the assessment plan. And before we do that, though, I want to emphasize adopting. A lot of people think they can just take a tool and just start using it at their own institution. And it's actually smarter to do a few things with that tool. Most of the time we have to change it to fit our needs. And so there's a little bit of changing going on. So that's why I say adapting. You can use a tool straight out of the box, which is adapting, but most of us do need to change it a little bit for our own institution. And that's okay, but we're going to talk about those steps. Okay, we talked about that assessment plan a little bit, and we're going to go ahead and get a little bit deeper into that. So when we talk about assessment, I really want to make sure that everyone is focused on learning objectives, and those learning objectives are founded on Bloom's taxonomy. Hopefully everyone, and well, I know everyone has, for the most part, I know at St. Paul's you talked about this because Pekalu has talked about it, but when we talk about these different skills, we talk about either cognitive, psychomotor, or affective domain, which align with knowledge, skills, and attitude. Today, we're going to talk predominantly just on skills, so the S component or the psychomotor. Now, a lot of people have seen the pyramid associated, this is the Bloom's taxonomy pyramid, and most people have seen this, but they have seen the cognitive domain pyramid. So I'm showing you the psychomotor because this is stuff we're talking about today. So just like the other pyramid for cognitive, if we start at the very, very basic foundation, we talk about imitation. And what do we mean by that is when folks are learning a task, they will start with just mimicking the person that's showing them. So say suturing, we might practice and watch a demonstration and practice and try to mimic them. And as we get better, we get more precise, which is in the middle of that section, and then eventually you do it without even thinking, which is naturalization of the very top. So I just wanted to make you guys aware of that pyramid. They are all different between the different domains, and most people don't look at the psychomotor domain. They look at the knowledge. The first thing that we want to do when we talk about our assessment plan, before you do anything, even before you go look at other people's tools, I want you to think about your purpose of the assessment. And when I typically think about that, are you wanting to do formative, which is basically when you want to give feedback to the learners. I just want to watch someone do something and I want to give them feedback so they can learn more about that skill and they can refine their skill that way. Summative, which is the one, typically the way that I think of this is at the end of the rotation, there's some consequences to it, and let's say you don't pass the thing and you don't move on, or you don't get to do surgical procedures. In some of our learner groups, like general surgery, if they don't pass a particular test with FLS, so the laparoscopic portion, they don't get to go in the OR. So that is considered a summative type of test. Whereas most of the time when we, especially in simulation, we do formative. You learn something, you give feedback, but you still use an assessment tool to rate them. Now here's this issue of when I talked about that assessment plan. In the assignments that you guys have, you have this example, and what I'm going to have you do is think about the kinds of assessment you want to target, and then that first assignment is actually using this example, and you have it as a handout so you can actually use it. It'll be easier to see. And I want you to develop an assessment plan, and I want you to talk about the learning objectives. I want you to talk about the different domains, and typically when we talk about performance assessment, it's knowledge and psychomotor. So sometimes I'm trying to think of a scenario. So let's say it's something task specific. Let's say, I don't know, it's a hysteroscopy thing or something. You have to have some level of knowledge about how to work an instrument. but you then also have that component of psychomotor skills. So in that domain, we want you to define what it is you're going to be assessing. Is it knowledge? Is it psychomotor? Or is it just, sometimes it's affect or attitude, but today we're not going to focus on that part. Okay, we talked about the assessment plan. Are you making a decision to do formative or summative? Are you using it simply for feedback, or will there be consequences associated with it? And that's summative. Formative, just feedback. The performance standard is a tricky part, and what we need to do is think about the items that you have on the assessment tool and the kind of standard or performance that you need to have to pass. The mechanism, excuse me, is mostly observation. Sometimes it's live observation, sometimes it's videotaped, but typically in performance assessment, it's observation of some kind. Okay, now we're going to talk about this looking for the existing tools. So let's talk about associations. There are a couple different places that I go to. I don't always, this is not in the order of how I start, but just the way that I'm presenting it. So don't take that in consideration. You can find things in a variety of places. When I'm going to look for curriculum, sometimes the first thing I'll do, because I don't want to reinvent the wheel, is I'll go to the different associations. So for example, I do a lot of surgical stuff, so I go to American College of Surgeons. They have an educational component, and so there's the online, the ACS, PDS online curriculum for residents, and that is something that we can tap into free of charge, I believe. And also ACOG has some components of curricular materials as well. So both of those are good places to start. Then I also look at CUSIN, which is a nurse-driven, mostly quality and control. It's quality and safety for nursing, but they have curricula associated with quality systems-based. So if you're doing a lot of team training or a particular protocol that you may be rolling out at your institution, that's where those things are. Finally, MedEd Portal, I really like them as well because it has the curriculum, it has any assessment tools, anything you're going to need to implement a curriculum, it's there. So the setup, the details, everything, which I really like. So that's a place to go. MedEd Portal, this is a picture of it. This is not a live thing, I'm not working off of it, but I used an example. Postpartum hemorrhage. So all I did was I typed in MedEd Portal PPH, and I actually got this back, and I gave this to you as a sample. This is a curriculum from Metzner, and it says ISIS on the front, and that is also included. So if you wanted to look at that, it's there. Just as an example. Now within Metzner's or in their curriculum, and it's like a big document, it's like a 90-page document. I dug out this particular assessment because that's what we're talking about. And what we have here, I think it was 47 items. It's quite extensive. There it is on both pages, but it's fairly easy to use because it's dichotomous. Those lines on the left, you kind of hard to see if you don't have the document in front of you, but you can click on those. If they did it, they get a check. And then it's summed, and they get a score at the end. So really, really simple. The other things that we can look at are search engines, and I predominantly go to PubMed, but really any of the sequenced or the public search engines you'll be able to find stuff there. Here is an example from Brogard, and I gave this to you as well. So going into PubMed, again, I used postpartum hemorrhage, and here's an example of a article for postpartum hemorrhage. This assessment, it's complicated, very hard to read on the screen, but I'll point out a few things. I think it has about 27 items, so each of these things going down the list are the items, and I think it has 5 domains. I looked at those on the left-hand side. And it's a 3-point rating scale. So the blue at the top, we look at these last sections over here on the right-hand side. those are the anchors for each of those items. So each item has very specific language on the condition and the quality of how you should be doing that task. This thing that's a little bit more daunting is the section of orange, and that where they have a weighting system. And so the interesting thing about this scale is you can use it in simulation, or you can use it in the clinical setting with patients. And that orange section allows for a weighting of the actual impact to patients. That was a very interesting scale, but very complicated to use. So a couple other sources that we have. I like simulation sources. So simulation, Society for Simulation in Healthcare sometimes has things. If you sign up on listservs, you may find things there. That does require a membership, and they only have, I think, individual memberships. I don't find that one to be particularly helpful, so it may or may not be worth it. And then this last thing called Odd Places, which I know is kind of strange. I didn't know what else to call it. And by that, I mean colleagues at other institutions. You might bump into someone even in different fields like business or something crazy like that. Sometimes that works. And I also connect with folks on those professional connection sites, like ResearchGate is one of them, but there's LinkedIn and there's some of the other ones. Sometimes you can actually find people in there if you spend the time, and you can connect directly with them through that. All right, let's see what else. Now, what I did, this is a checklist from a friend of mine. When I said weird places, my weird place was a friend of mine, Dr. Hayes, who's out of Loyola. She was actually working on a QBL, which is quantification of blood loss. That's QBL is kind of a common phrase used here, but not probably outside the United States, because it was a U.S. group that just recently rolled this thing out. And it's a way of measuring blood loss during delivery. So she has this checklist, and it's a little more simple, hard to read again, but it's 27 items, and it's dichotomously scored like the first scale that we saw. It's either done or not done, and I'll highlight that here. And it's pretty straight up. They either did it or they didn't do it. And that's what makes it nice, although it is, because it's long, it can be sometimes a challenge. So we'll talk about some of the differences in assessment tools in this Evaluate Your Tools. So you may have a bunch of tools that you're considering, if you're lucky, if you found them. And so for right here, I've put up the two examples that I found that I was most happy with. I did not put the Brogard one up because I thought it was quite complicated and it might be tough to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to evaluate my two tools, and I'll tell you how to do that. So I have two that I'm thinking about. And on one, this section that has the X in it, this is the Metzger. Cool. Thank you. On the Metzger assessment, there's a section about preoperative prep, and that's not what I needed for my learning objectives. That wasn't covered in that session. So I'm like, oh, okay, I can get rid of that section. Great. And then we have this other stuff down here that I think it was about, I think it was post-op, if I remember right. And so that was a question that I was like, maybe I want that, so I'm not going to touch that. And then looking at my other one, we'll see, okay, there's language about a technology called Neptune. Well, I know that's a very specific brand of a suction unit, so maybe I don't have that, and maybe I need something else, so I'm going to have to change the language. And that's okay. It's just things to look at and think about. Then there's items that I don't want. There's things that, doesn't align with my protocol, so I nix them. Does that make sense? Easy enough. That's the first pass, okay? So then I have these two tools. And what do? I really look at, and I don't want to go too deep in this, but a lot of people get nervous when I start talking about validity. And really what I want to do, Don't shut out. Don't turn it off yet. Don't walk away. I'm talking about reliability. So I look at literature review on these things. Do these folks that have developed this thing talk about reliability? Then do they talk about these issues of generalizability? How many learners have they used it with? Can they tell me what different institutions they might have used it with, or different units, or different services? So that's important because I want to make sure that the tool is generalizable to me. So that's something to think about. This reference at the bottom is a good reference for validity, but because we're not really talking about that today, I just have it as reference, and I have it on my list of references at the end of the slide deck or the video that you got. So take a look at that if you'd like to learn more about validity. So what do I do about this? So we have these two tools moving forward into evaluating these things, but what I want you to do then is pull out that assessment plan. That's why it's so important to develop it beforehand. And then what we're going to do is we decide we're going to nix one. So I removed one, and let's say I'm going to predominantly focus on this other tool. And then what I do is I take that tool, or it could even be the tool plus some components of the initial tool. You can combine tools, that's okay. You get it roughed out the way that it makes sense to you, and you give that to a focus group. So we take it to the focus group, and ideally you want to have at least 5 experts that have taught this topic and are familiar with it clinically. So you really want people that know what they're doing ideally. And when you take it to the focus group, a videotape, it'd be good if you videotaped it or audio tape it, or at a minimum have someone take notes. Okay? Because we all forget, we get into these discussions and it can be a little bit crazy. So with that assessment plan, you want to look at the critical items that are on that form. Do you want to keep them? Yes or no? And you might even have new critical items. Maybe you have a protocol or something that's important on your side that is missing in that assessment tool, and you add those. You remove the things that are not relevant or not critical, and then you look at the scoring. Sometimes, like I said, it's dichotomous. It's yes, no. That's easy. But sometimes you want a global rating or even a 5-point scale for each of those items, depending on the nuances of the rating. So that's something to decide. And finally, you want to determine the organization of items. You may have, for example, I'm trying to think of an assessment tool that I have. I have a tool for code management, and one domain is leadership, and one domain is actually doing the clinical, the resuscitation part. And so that's 2 domains, and sometimes it's organized via domain, or sometimes it might just be organized via chronological order of the process in which the scenario rolls out. And that is something to be determined by the focus group as well. And then now we're going to talk about finalizing the items and then the metrics or the measures that we use. Sometimes it's not just a checklist measure, but other things as well. So what I like to do, so you get this thing after the focus group, you recompile your items, so you think you have a pretty good idea of what this assessment looks like. What I would do, if you have someone that does education or assessment, that's their thing, that's what they get excited about. It's my thing, it's what I get excited about. Then have them review it for clarity of language. Also have your focus group talk about that clarity of language, because even physicians, when they read something, you might very well think that item is very clear, but your colleagues may not. And so have them review it as well. And once everyone thinks it's great, then have an assessment education person, or even someone outside of the clinical world. I know this sounds kind of crazy, but even have your AA, your administrative assistant, or even your partner, your spouse, read it and say, does this make sense? Because you really want folks to understand it quickly when they're doing the assessment, okay? And the other thing that I like to do is make sure that these items are discrete unless required. And I'm going to point out a few things here. So we have this item, and I'll zoom it up. I'm going to read it. After abdomen closed, the designee RN, which is the nurse, or the surgical tech ST, weighs uterine expression, clots from drape, blood on floor, and records in QBL calculator. That is a very big item with many parts to it. And as an assessment person, I hate these kinds of items. But in talking with the focus group, that is a process that folks do in one fell swoop. So psychologically, and I talk to the nurses about this and the surgical techs, because that's their task. That's why it's good to have them on the focus group. I had them read it and say, okay, I don't like this language. I did not like that all of those bits and pieces were in one item. And they said, no, we do it all at one time. It's all one process. So for them, it makes sense to do it as one item. So that's something that comes out in the focus group, and I left it as one item because it made sense in the process. Okay. Then what you want to do also is have your sim specialist look at it to make sure that the alignment of what you're doing is actually able to do. So for example, that wasn't very clear. If you need to measure a particular clinical something, say EKG, but your simulator can't do that, then you have to either get a new simulator or you have to change your item on the assessment. So it's more of a logical process. That's why I like to have the sim specialist look at it as well. Okay. So then, all of that, crazy, I know. I do it one last time. I have folks look at it, clinicians look at it, your assessment folks that are going to be judging it, and I actually have them rate each item again and say, and have them tell us how important that particular item is for that assessment and for that purpose. And you'll see this, I think you can read it. You'll have an item and you're asking them to rate how important is that item. And if you find out that they're all important, then keep them all. And if you find out that they're not important, dump them. And if you're not sure, meaning they say they likely should include it, then keep it and we evaluate later one more time after you roll it out to identify whether or not it was a good item. Now on this form, one of the things that I think is important is this demographic section. And so we want to find out the people that have done the rating to help support the validity, which we call generalizability. So you want to have, like, for example, this happens to be an MVA form, manual vacuum aspiration, and it could be obstetrics, it could be obstetrics gynecology, or some maybe potentially even another specialty perhaps. You want to get all that information there along with their level of expertise. And so I always like to ask a question about the number of those particular procedures they've performed, whether it be that last month, in the last week, or in the last year, depending on how common they are, because I want to make sure that I document my validity evidence. This is what that is, to make sure that this tool is going to be the best tool, especially if you're going to publish it. That's the important thing. If you're not going to publish it, this may not be as important, but it's good to do some kind of check and balances at your own institution. Here's where we would add a task or delete a task and have them scribble on it and write on it. Totally fine. Now we talked about the scoring. Once they do the scoring, you get all your sums from your experts, and if the mean is less than 2.5, you traditionally delete that item. And then if it's over or equal to 2.5, I keep it. Okay.
Deb, there might be some questions in the chat section.
Okay, so I'm going to read this out loud. Why couldn't we use performance assessments, the standard checklist that are developed previously by well-nominated organizations like WHO Standards? You absolutely can. The only thing that I would recommend is all you have to do. I would have a focus group still and do this process. Just have them look at the items and go through this rating and do a similar thing. So we know at your own institution, sometimes the WHO content is absolutely perfect. Sometimes you may have to change the language just a little bit to make sure that your users will understand it. So for example, sometimes in Britain, they would say consultant versus attending. I know that sounds crazy, but it's minor, but there's different tweaks that you would just simplify just a little bit. So your own institution, it fits and it reads better and it's easier for the raters. But absolutely, you can use that. But I would suggest that process. And it doesn't take very much, really, I promise.
Please repeat the explanation on the assessment plan, not very clear.
So the assessment plan is just a written document and some way of documenting the process that you've decided on that's best before you go looking for a tool. Because what happens is if you have an idea that you want to do, for example, blood loss, you want to manage blood loss better for postpartum hemorrhage, you may have a certain idea of what your own learning objectives are, and that is important to make sure that whatever the tool is aligns with your learning objectives. So it's important before you go looking for the tool to write your learning objectives. I'm going to say that again. If someone's assessment does not align with your learning objectives, it's very easy just to say, oh, there's an assessment tool. That's great. I'm going to use it. But it doesn't capture or reflect everything that you need and your learners need at your own institution. So that's why at a minimum, write your learning objectives. And what I mean by that, what do you need the learners to walk away from? What knowledge, what skills, okay? When you write it down, it becomes a plan. That's why, that's all I'm saying. The domain and the specifics of those domains, basically is it a knowledge domain or is it a psychomotor domain? Or sometimes it's an affective domain. Sometimes we have a new technology. We talked about that crazy suction unit. Well, we have one of those at our institution and the nurses hated it. They were afraid of it because it was new technology. And so we actually had to measure an affective component because we didn't want the nurses to be nervous about using it. Maybe at your institution, you're not using the crazy technology. Maybe, I've met people in other institutions here that don't use that technology. And so that's not an issue. So again, across institutions, it's important to know that domain and the specific outcomes of what they're going to be able to do under each domain. That just takes the learning objectives and chunks them down into the specific domains. Okay. The assessment plan, really what I mean is, are you going to have consequences to this test or are you only using it as feedback? And I don't mean only in a diminutive sense, but if you don't have to worry about the consequences, will they not be able to go to the OR? Or will they need to get 5 of these in a practice simulation before they go to the OR? And how well do they need to do that? Then rolls into the performance standard. How well must they complete a particular task before you say, okay, you're checking them off? And in performance checklists, if I'm doing a mastery model, which means they have to get it 100% right. In other models, it's not a mastery model, and you might be okay with 80%, or maybe the non-critical things. So that needs to be determined before you start applying any kind of assessment tool. Those last 2 columns, I don't find as important when you go seek out your assessment tool, but you need to have an idea, okay? Sometimes the scoring is determined by your assessment tool, but you need to have a good idea going into that. Like, for example, looking at those 2 checklists that I pulled up, the one from Metzger and the one from Brogard. Brogard was the one with the crazy checklist with all the different boxes and the patient waiting and all of that. That complexity was important because they wanted to also do assessment in the clinical setting. If you don't need that or don't want to do that, don't add the complexity. So that's why that needs to be discussed in general beforehand. You don't have to be hard and fast, but have a good idea about what your plan is. So that's why I have people write this out before they look at the assessment plan. So when you get that assessment plan, you know the foundation of what you need, and that way you can change the assessment plan to meet your needs, not change your needs to meet the assessment plan. Hopefully that makes sense.
Is it possible to use a means for Likert scale type ratings? For example, C, and then there's a long list, MBA scenarios checklist. If mean used is that the distance between each rating scales are assumed to be equal.
Okay, good question. And the answer is, it depends. It's a terrible answer. Generally, it is okay to have, I personally like Likert scales as long as at least 3, because Likert means 5, or Likert type scale means a 5-point scale. So if 3 is anchored, and what I mean by that is if the language is clear between 1 on the poor end, 3, generally it's competent or adequate or some language that says you've passed, and 5 is superior or excellent, then generally it's okay. I like these Likert scales because I think they offer better feedback to the learner instead of saying, yes, you did it, no, you didn't. There's no gray zone. Sometimes you do it slowly or awkwardly or poorly or partially. And the yes-no component does not allow for that. So if you're giving feedback to the learners, I'm going to say it again, the Likert scale is great as long as, and I prefer, some degree of anchoring on those letters or on those anchors or on those rating scales or whatever I'm trying to say. On each rating, I would like to have some anchor. Does it require a paragraph to describe the quality of each performance? Not necessarily. That makes it very hard for the raters to use. So I, at a minimum, like poor, competent, and superior, or something along those lines that your raters will understand. And I don't necessarily assume equality, but from a psychometric perspective, when you're running analysis, any kind of software or any kind of model generally does assume. So keep that in mind when you actually develop your ratings and when you run your analysis. The main point is identifying that critical pass mark and measuring that and anchoring it correctly. I hope that answers that question.
So, for example, see Appendix F and G, and how could we summarize such 5 points and more Likert scalings?
I'm looking at Appendix F of the curriculum associated with Metzger, and it's a team evaluation form. And so I'm trying to understand the question. All right, so we have the rating, and it's truly a Likert scale that says strongly disagree is 1, disagree 2, 3 is neutral, agree is 4, and strongly agree. And you have to rate the agreement. And the first, as an example, the team member, this is the first item, team member, clear understanding of his or her role. So you are asked to rate your agreement, and this is a true Likert scale, of that statement, clear understanding of his or her role. So the language that's the basis of this scale should be prompted by a small prompt at the top saying, please rate your agreement with, and there's no prompt, which can be a problem, but you would like to know how to change that over to an anchored performance rating. What I'm guessing is, could we translate the language of each anchor to say, so the domain or the question might be, team member has clear understanding of his or her role, let me think about this. degree of understanding, I'm trying to think, degree of understanding of team member's role or something like that. And then the anchor would be no understanding of their role for number one, little understanding of their role for number two, some understanding of their role for neutral or decent understanding, clear understanding of their role, superior understanding of the role. If you're going to reword every anchor, I mean, there are 20 different ways to skin this cat. And what you want is the easiest one for your raters. Personally, I would go with the Likert scale because that is a commonly known rating scale and it's clear. And the amount of time it takes a rater to read the language of each of those anchors becomes time consuming and a cognitive load that I would not want to put on them. Sometimes it's really important though. So it might be an item that, like for example, number 3 on this, and I'm going to read it. Ask for assistance if unable to complete task during task overload. That is something that could be written as request for assistance as needed. And then the anchors become, for one, would be did not request any assistance even when required. 3, I would do ask appropriately for assistance as needed. And superior would be clearly requests assistance, anticipating the need, or something like that. I don't think I would put anchors on the ones in between because it's just way too much for a reviewer to read. Okay.
There was an additional note on here. You may have already answered it. I'm not sure, but is that strongly agree means twice agree, question mark, or the raters have different views. How could we summarize their ratings using a mean?
Okay, good question. There has been a lot of discourse about the mathematical difference, categorical difference between those in terms of strongly agree versus agree. When I run analysis, I do not weight anything differently. I treat them as the categories they're numbered. So for example, and sometimes I will change strongly disagree. If I have a rating of, like for example, ask for assistance as in Appendix F, ask for assistance. If that rating is did not ask for assistance, I will actually mark that as 0. And that's more of a cognitive thing on the reporting. So as a psychometrician, when I report it, a 0 means none, like literally did not ask. And so cognitively, I will change that into a 4-point scale, even though it's truly a 5-point scale, but the first degree is a 0. And so that's more of a cognitive reporting decision. I do not double weight. I don't say strongly agree is worth 2 times more than agree. I keep it as a 5 and agree as a 4. That way it's consistent with how the raters know it. And it is assumed from a quantifiable perspective that 5 is 1 more than a 4. So you really need to look at the language of your anchors. If you're going to write those things out, there's a cognitive component about determining whether or not a superior is 10 times more or 2 times more than adequate. That's why some people with milestones with the ACGME go to a 7-point scale, and that allows just that little bit more of differentiation between the groups. But I personally think that 3 is most effective. Done partially, not done. Something along those lines for me is adequate enough to give feedback to the learner or allows some differentiation. Now, if the qualities of the nuances of those each of those steps is really important, then I will do a 5, but I typically don't. Typically, I do a 3. because I find that to be a better balance, and it allows some feedback to the learner if they didn't do it correctly.
For research purpose, we use Likert scale. Can we assume the assumption of normality distribution or consider parametric statistics like Likert scale, and how could we summarize and report such findings?
Okay, great question. Again, the answer is it depends. And this is where I'm going to get a little bit stats brained, but that's a stats question, so I'm going to answer it appropriately. I would check for normality, and you can do your distribution in SPSS and check. And for folks that are not stats people, they may recognize the whole language associated with the normal curve, which means you get people on either side of the extremes that have lower or higher ratings, and then most people are kind of lumped in the middle, which is the middle ratings. If you have a skewed distribution, which means a lot of people are going either more toward the lower range or more toward the higher range, then you don't have, or even sometimes I see bimodal distributions, which are crazy, which means you have a big lump in the back end, you have a big lump on the front end. And what you would do then, and now I understand the question about the means, I would use, and I would check, and I try to check because I run my own data, and if we can't use a normal stat, say you're doing group comparisons or mean comparisons with ANOVA or something along those lines, or a student t-test, then I would shift over to a non-parametric statistics like Kruskal-Wallis or Wilcoxon rank sum, or Wilcoxon rank sum for independent sample tests. Hang on, I'm going to say it again. Wilcoxon rank sum for comparing two independent groups, and Wilcoxon sign ranked is the equivalent of student paired t-test. And they report out in medians. Now, for the signed rank, I have to think about this. Sign ranked is only medians reported, and the rank sum, they also report the mean. They do both, if I remember correctly. So that's a little bit statistically heavy, I'm sorry, but the person that asked that has some knowledge about that, so I think that's the kind of answer that they're looking for. But yes, I always check for normality, and I either run standard classical stuff, or I'll run non-parametric, like Kruskal-Wallis is a good safe bet, or get specific to a Wilcoxon. Some people call it a Mann-Whitney-U test, and I think that's fairly interchangeable.
Can we develop our own checklist based on our objectives, purposes of assessment? Is the databases and literature review a must?
Great question. A lot of times there's nothing out there. Sometimes you're developing a curriculum that just doesn't exist, or an assessment tool that doesn't exist. Absolutely develop it on your own, but this is where, especially if you're going to publish it, and if you have a plan to share it with other institutions or other units or other specialties, go through that process of checking those items. And then what I would do is one more step at the end that I didn't get to is after you run your first cohort, you really want to look at the ideal thing is videotape the performances. You have your live rater, and then you have other raters that are going to evaluate the performances or assess the residents, for whoever the trainees are, their performances via the videotape. And you're going to look at inter-rater reliability or some level of agreement to make sure your reliability is good. That's the first thing I would do. I would also, before you even run that cohort, make sure that tool and each item go through that process and have a focus group and have people really rip apart your items, add items, check for clarity, do your test with your assessment person and your simulation person to make sure those items are as good as they can be. They won't be good, I can tell you that right now. There's always a problem on the first run. Unless you guys are rock stars and you're going to be way better than me, and you could, for sure. But always check it after that first cohort and look at your reliability and look at the items. What I then do is I look at the items. Are there some that just are not discriminating? Maybe everyone's getting it correct, or they're rock stars. Do you really need to use it and take up the assessor's time to put that on the checklist? Sometimes you do, because it's a minimal competent thing or minimal task that needs to be absolutely, they have to be competent at. If it's super, super hard and no one is getting it correct, it means you're not training to it, or the item is poorly written, or it's multi-phased, multi-parted, and it's a problem with the item. So there's certain things to look at.
Thank you so much, Deb, for all of your work, your preparation on both of the modules. This was fantastic.